We continue on coverage in Zimbabwe. Let's take a look at the latest developments now as journalists in Zimbabwe continue to push for the reform of oppressive media laws and more media freedom. Our threats and intimidation have recently resurfaced with journalists Oppah Muchinguri and Jacob Ngaravume charged with incitement to public violence. And to talk a little bit about the latest news from Zimbabwe, we're joined by Dewa Mavhinga, Southern Africa Director for Human Rights Watch. Dewa, a very good morning to you. Thank you very much for joining us here on Newzroom Afrika. I mean, just looking at the reactions coming through upon the release of Oppah Muchinguri and Jacob Ngaravume, I mean, how are they doing? The conditions that they were also released on, I mean, what do you as the organization make of it?
Well, Oppah Muchinguri and Jacob Ngaravume are now out on bail after over 40 days in pre-trial detention where they were repeatedly denied bail. This is justice denied. They were subjected to ill treatment while in custody at a maximum security prison where they should not have been in the first place because they are facing, flimsy, politically motivated charges. And I've spoken to Jacob, and they say that the conditions under which they were held in at Shikurubi Maximum Prison are really appalling. Overcrowded conditions, unsanitary, not even running water, and no COVID-19 protective clothing for prisoners. And this is a confirmation of the high-level corruption that has taken resources away from where they are needed. But also the justice process has been corrupted because these activists, anti-corruption activists, these journalists like Oppah Muchinguri have been persecuted for exposing corruption, for doing their work, and the law is being used to do the persecution, which is unacceptable, which shows that the Zimbabwe authorities are not committed to respecting the rule of law, free expression, and human rights generally.
And they were looking at the role of journalists, ultimately the treatment that you highlighted by both Oppah Muchinguri and Jacob Ngaravume, which they've recounted. I mean, in lieu of this, how has it deterred other journalists perhaps from speaking out? I mean, as you mentioned, upon their release, they're not able to also, they've been ordered to not post anything on social media, and they're rather strict measures that have been imposed by the court. How has this deterred other journalists from effectively carrying out their jobs?
Well, this shocking treatment of such high-level, high-profile journalists like Oppah Muchinguri strikes fear in the hearts of ordinary journalists that if such things can happen to someone like Oppah Muchinguri with utter impunity on the part of the authorities, to the point of even withdrawing his lawyers, denying him the right to choose a lawyer, it certainly means that many journalists are now afraid to touch on corruption that relates to high-profile figures. And so there is that fear that is very real because the trial of Oppah Muchinguri, the denial of bail many times was played out in the public. And now these very strict conditions of barring them even from communicating on social media, it shows a heavy-handed response on the part of the Zimbabwe authorities, and they have been labeled terrorists and they have been banded together as bad apples. And this is a huge challenge for journalism in Zimbabwe. And we are saying as Human Rights Watch that journalism is not a crime and that the authorities must respect, media freedoms in Zimbabwe.
There are reports coming through that Oppah Muchinguri, has said he will continue to post and do his job ultimately, despite the court orders that had been issued. Based on this report, and should he continue, I mean, what is ultimately going to happen to him? What will be the follow-up from government if he pursues?
Well, yes, we know that Oppah Muchinguri is incredibly strong and remains fired up and committed to do his work. But the problem is that there is no rule of law, there is no respect for human rights, and it is likely that the persecution will continue because, in fact, Oppah remains facing false charges of inciting public violence, and those charges have not gone away. The trial is to continue, so it means that the state of Zimbabwe might still use that process to incarcerate him as a way of punishing him for exposing high-level corruption involving the first family of Zimbabwe, the Mnangagwa family. And that's a huge problem that we are facing. And we're saying that the law must be for everyone. No one should be, treated as a special candidate for persecution simply because they are doing their work in journalism.
Now, Dewa, on that note, I mean, it is rather complex, and it will take a lot of time to unpack what the laws look like with regards to media in Zimbabwe. But ultimately, looking at the freedom of press in Zimbabwe, the challenges that they continue to face, the expectations that they've had, from the transition under a Mugabe rule into Emerson Mnangagwa era. I mean, looking at access to information, the various acts pertaining to that, the Criminal Law Act, even the Broadcasting Act. I mean, what are some of the reforms that you are hoping to see come into fruition based on what has just happened to these two journalists?
Well, the most basic reforms of respecting media freedom, respecting the rights of journalists, some of the rights are even enshrined in the existing Zimbabwe Constitution of 2013. But the problem has been total disregard of those rights by the Zimbabwean authorities, but also opening up the airwaves, bringing in a multiplicity or a plurality of voices, not just government voices. Can you imagine that Zimbabwe has got basically one national TV station and nothing else, and bringing out different voices and accepting that there can be different voices that can exist without muzzling and controlling the narrative. People must be free to speak. But we know that, in fact, the government is moving to control the airwaves, to control social media. There is what they call the Cyber Crimes Bill. So the laws on the cards are laws to further control and remove the rights of the media and of journalists in Zimbabwe.
Dewa, what support is on offer for journalists as we speak, both financial and even medical assistance? What does it look like?
Well, it's a nightmare. It's really a move to make it extremely, almost impossible for journalists to practice in terms of the licenses, in terms of the license for individual and small companies. It's a move to silence the voice of sure that really there is one dominant narrative, which is the government narrative, which is put out there. So there is really a little hope that under Mnangagwa, there is going to be any respect of journalistic rights. And the conduct of the security forces, of the police, is also one that there is constant harassment of journalists. It's not only Oppah Muchinguri, there are many others who are facing different false charges simply because they are independent and seek to assert themselves as such.
Dave, I'm going to have to conclude this conversation. Ultimately, just wanting to look at what standing solidarity looks like as, we continue to raise the alarms, tell the stories that need to be told. But what are the roles of SADC, the African Union, organizations, international community at large to keep pressure on the Zimbabwe government to, implement these much-needed reforms that you've mentioned earlier?
Well, Zimbabwe's neighbors must speak out and continue to apply pressure, and South Africa has begun to do that. That's an important first step. But groups like SADC and the African Union must step in, must investigate for themselves, must see for themselves the abuses that are there, and must speak out in defense of human rights as outlined in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And the solidarity that is coming is very important because Zimbabwe must know that it is on the spotlight. It cannot get away with these abuses and these horrendous, crimes that it is committing. So it is important to have this regional, particularly regional pressure on Zimbabwe so that they do the right thing. and that it is on record that abuses are not acceptable and journalism is not a crime.
Dewa Mavhinga, we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Dewa Mavhinga is the Southern African Director at Human Rights Watch, and he joined us this morning to chat about press freedom and the latest emerging from Zimbabwe.